The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts, Debi and Sam.
Today's topic is the broken border, and we are joined by our special guest, Lacy Cooper, who is joining us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so just so that you can, because people probably are not going to know who you are, if you can just explain who you are, tell us a little bit about your family, your backstory, whatever you want to share with us today.
Well, I am an attorney, and right now I'm at a law firm close by the church, actually, where we're recording. I do mostly civil litigation, but I also advise churches and nonprofits, and a big part of what I do in advising churches and nonprofits is that I give advice with respect to mandatory reporting, and that's because before this part of my career, I was a criminal prosecutor for about 15 years. I started at Gila County up in Payson, Arizona, small town. I started as a misdemeanor prosecutor, and essentially that means that you have a bunch of people coming in the door who've done something that's made a mistake in their life. It's usually not very serious, but they're having to have some consequence for that. And they meet with me individually, one-on-one, and have a conversation about what the consequence should be. And my goal in that meeting would be to make sure that they feel cared for and respected, but also ensure that justice was done. And because it was a small town, then I would see those same people at Walmart or, at Safeway later in the day, right?
Yep.
That's the nature of small towns. So that was actually a really great start to my career. And then I quickly started doing more serious crimes, and I did, in particular, a lot of child abuse crimes and child sexual abuse in particular. And so I took that experience now to advising clients about how do they make sure that kids are safe on their campus at a nonprofit or a church or a school. And I also was at the U.S. Attorney's Office for a while. I was a prosecutor there. And because we're in Arizona, a big part of the work that the U.S. Attorney's Office does here is prosecuting border crimes.
Yeah.
So I was a prosecutor of basically people coming across the border illegally, drugs coming across the border illegally, firearms and money going south to the cartels in Mexico. I did some cartel wiretap investigations.
Oh, wow.
I prosecuted some terrorists who came into the country illegally. And I did some gang prosecutions of folks who were getting their drugs from the cartels. So a lot of border work during that season of my career, which was about 6-7 years.
Wow.
Awesome. Wow. A very impressive resume.
Right.
And I can see why you also have a passion for protecting the border. Both trafficking and smuggling have been happening at our border for years. Can you explain the difference between those and explain some of the dangers of both to our listeners?
Yeah, that's a great question because sometimes people use those words interchangeably, trafficking and smuggling. But in fact, they're different things, at least in the legal world, in our lexicon. They mean different things. So smuggling is just when someone is helping to guide somebody. In this case, we're talking about across the border illegally. So think about a coyote who is bringing somebody across the southwest border through Arizona or Texas or California, and they're helping to smuggle that person. That person is going voluntarily and willingly, and they've paid money, actually, to the smuggler, the smuggling organization, to get them safely across the border. But they are not kidnapped in any way. They're not taken against their will, right?
Right. That makes sense.
Trafficking is almost always associated with sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And I know that you all have probably educated your listeners a lot about the sex trafficking side of the house, but it's essentially you've taken somebody maybe against their will, or maybe initially they went voluntarily, but now they're beholden to the person who's taken them, and they're being used for sex for income. Or in the labor trafficking world, they're being used to provide labor. And we see it in connection with the border. We see labor trafficking. For instance, I mentioned that somebody has to pay money to a smuggling organization to get across the border, right? Yeah. Well, if they don't have the money, the cash to pay that up front, they might make an arrangement with the smuggling organization to owe a debt. And then they come into the United States and they have to work off that debt that they owe to the smuggling organization. And typically they are given unfavorable terms to work off that debt. They're asked to pay a certain amount of money every day, but that's how their wages are going toward things like their housing and their food, and so there's not really any money going to pay off the debt, and they can end up in this indentured servitude relationship for a very long time. So that's really the distinction between the two.
Okay.
And then when you're talking about either drugs or guns, do you use the term smuggling or trafficking? Or is it a different word?
Actually, you can use smuggling and trafficking for both. Usually you say firearms trafficking, drug trafficking, but you can also use smuggling for drugs. I don't know why we've really made that distinction in the human smuggling world, probably because drugs aren't paying money to get across. Firearms aren't paying money. They're inanimate objects, right? Yeah. But when it comes to humans, there is this kind of critical distinction between somebody who has offered to pay a sum of money in order to get a service of being transported in a manner that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do themselves.
Right.
Versus against your will.
Yeah, and so now I know that with some of the stuff that President Trump has done and with at the border, and that a lot of that has been protected, right? There's a lot. It's more protected now than it has been at the border, but. Then, there's also, I think for years and years, I know I heard this, that for years and years, it's like that you have people being told that, okay, it's against the law, but it's not really that big of a deal to come across. And so just come on over. You have politicians and groups sort of giving this idea that they're not going to be prosecuted, they're not going to be caught, they're not going to be, so then you have a lot of people who are in a desperate situation. That's why I think we've seen so many in a lot of ways. And from my perspective, I mean, I grew up in Arizona, so I've lived here, and you hear it kind of from all different angles of things that are going on. But I don't know, have you seen that on the prosecutorial end of it?
Yeah, and Debbie, I want to talk through a lot of the misimpressions that you've even alluded to right now. But just on the first, let me address. We had a president not that long ago,
right,
who gave the message that you were describing. Yeah, that it's okay to come across the border illegally. That there's a sort of invitation to come across the border illegally.
Get
that there's
free health care, free education, free,
there's not going to be any consequence. And in fact, there's going to be these rewards. And the result was that we saw far more people coming across the border illegally under the Biden administration. In fact, it started immediately after he took office, or perhaps even we started to see an uptick right after the election in 2020. Guess what? Now that Trump has come back into the White House, we've seen a significant drop. And I just want to share some numbers if I can, because the contrast is pretty stark. And in January of 2024, when Biden was in office, there were 176,000 apprehensions of migrants at the southwest border. Now, what does apprehensions mean? It just means that Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection have there's different segments of CBP have actually taken somebody into custody who's crossed illegally or who is crossed illegally.
They're catching them sort of in the act of crossing, right? That they catch them in the act of doing it.
Exactly. That number doesn't really reflect the number of people who cross. illegally.
Right, because if they're here and no one caught
Right.
them as they were crossing, then they're living here, and we don't know how long they've been here, and some of them have been here for decades, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even every month at the border, a number of people are able to get through without getting apprehended. But
Right.
just for comparison, 176,000 in January. President Trump came into office in January of 2025. That number dropped to 61,000. So
Wow.
cut in third.
Yeah.
The very next month after he was fully in office, compared to February of 2024, when Biden was in office, 189,000 apprehensions. Under the Trump administration's first full month, 11,000.
Wow.
11,000.
Yeah.
Let me tell you from Border Patrol's perspective, that is a very reasonable number of apprehensions. That's a number of migrants that they can manage
Yeah.
successfully. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised. It's hard to find those numbers of the folks who weren't caught.
Right.
But they usually have some sense based on technology and also the movement of migrants of how many were not caught. And I would suspect that number has also reduced dramatically, and partly because Border Patrol now can use their resources to go out and patrol as they're supposed to
Yeah,
and make sure
that's
that
right.
people aren't crossing
Right.
illegally. So now we have a far lower number of migrants crossing into the country illegally. And I think that the long-term benefits on our country and also on the migrants are pretty significant to having a controlled border.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, because one of the issues, so I want to talk about the human capital involved in why it's not compassionate to leave that just open because of what happens with, you alluded to it a minute ago of talking about being basically placed into indentured servitude. That's something that is not that uncommon. I want to get back to that in a minute, but even just the other side of that with drugs, we know that fentanyl has been a big problem, and a lot of that fentanyl was coming from across the border. You were talking about weapons coming across the border. If you were a terrorist and you were trying to sneak into this country, that would be the easiest place in my mind, over the last several years. That would be the easiest way to get in. I mean, unless you're overstaying a visa or coming in, some other way or getting radicalized here, because that does happen too.
Right.
But can you talk a little bit about some of those kinds of dangers of like the drugs and the weapons and gang members and people that are coming specifically? So not talking about people that are in that group of they believe they're just trying to seek a better life, and they may be told or willing to risk it that they're going to not get caught, but they don't have any sort of nefarious plans. They're just poor and in a bad place and trying to have a better life, right? But then there are criminal other things that are going on.
Right.
Not that obviously that is a crime to come in, and I'm not saying that, but
Right,
what I am saying is I'm talking about where they're deliberately trying to get drugs or guns or gang members or violent things that are coming across the border.
Yeah, I understand that your question, and
Yeah.
and I appreciate that we're going to also talk a little bit about the humanitarian aspects of
Yes.
the folks who are just choosing to come here, but maybe don't have a nefarious purpose. But what's the harms that are
Right.
involved there as well? But I do think it's really important to talk about the fact that the movement of migrants into the country and the movement of drugs into the country work in tandem.
Yeah.
It's the same smuggling organizations, maybe different branches of the same cartels that are moving both products.
Right.
Both are chattel in their world,
Right.
drugs and humans. And they will use humans to absorb all of Border Patrol's resources at a particular spot on the border so that they can move drugs, so oftentimes the more lucrative product, through the opening in the border that's created. They're
Interesting.
Always working both of those at the same time. Now, drugs actually, the price of drugs kind of goes, up and down depending on demand, right? It's just like anything else in our country, there's a supply and demand. But same with humans, and so they can charge a certain price for a human to cross. And so in many ways, they're both very lucrative. and one talks back and, one doesn't. So the cartels have to decide which of those things they really want to worry about at a particular time. But one has legs and can walk, and the other one you can, store in the trunk of a car and try
Right.
to
Yeah.
get it through the port of entry.
Right.
No, usually they don't put it in the trunk. They put it in like a side panel, a hidden compartment. But anyway, so the allowing there to be an open border where people can move freely
Yes.
into the United States, and freely I mean with the control of the cartels, is only giving more money and freedom to the cartels to move drugs into the United States. And then the firearms is just the cartels are incredibly violent organizations. Like I said, I did some cartel wiretap investigations, and so I was listening to their phone calls. I was reading their text messages. The kinds of conversations that they were having were pretty incredible. In fact, it was common in one particular organization that we were looking into that was very violent to monthly we would have to make a decision how we were going to protect someone's life because we knew that a hit had been placed on one of their own members usually, or somebody who was lower down the ranks who had
Right.
lost a load of drugs, something like that. We had one individual who went missing. It was a United States citizen, went missing in Mexico, and the cartel apparently found him because they sent word back that he was no longer with us, and they sent a photograph, and it was of just a torso.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Severing limbs is something that is pretty common with the cartels, but they're also very, very heavily armed, and you can't get guns easily in Mexico, so they have to get their guns from the United States, which means that it has to be smuggled across the border, back to Mexico. And the more resources that our law enforcement agencies are spending on humans coming across, the less resources they have to make sure that guns aren't going to Mexico where they're being used to terrorize Mexican citizens and also to terrorize the migrants.
Right.
It's a cycle, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so you were saying that pretty much anybody who gets smuggled across who pays somebody to help them, that's all cartel.
Yes.
That almost exclusively cartel that is controlling that, right?
Yes.
The payment of people. And so then along with that, we were talking in our pre-meeting, some of the human capital and the things that happen as people are coming across the border, stories that don't get reported on in the news, things that are happening to people. We already did talk about them being forced to continue to work because they can't ever pay the debt that they owe to the smugglers, to the cartel that help them get across the border. But then there's other things, a lot, especially for women and children, violence and things that are happening. And I think you were talking too even about seeing the same kids coming back and forth with adults. So maybe share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've said before, cartels make terrible babysitters. So essentially, these women and children who are paying, or someone is paying for them to come into the United States, they're entrusting their lives and safety to these terrorist organizations that are heavily armed and that really don't care about humans. In fact, to get initiated into the organization, you have to commit some pretty violent acts. So it is very common for women to be sexually assaulted on their journey into the United States. And they're handed off to sort of a variety of smuggling organizations. Depends on how far you're coming, right? If you live right at the Mexican border versus, let's say you're coming up from South America and you have to go through the Darien Gap, which is a very, very violent part of the trail. Many women, female migrants, at some point realized that they're almost certainly going to get raped, and so they would carry birth control or other contraceptives with them, or get a contraceptive shot before they took the journey, just to make sure that they didn't get pregnant by a smuggler's act along the way. Very common. It's hard to know exactly how many women and girls are sexually assaulted, but I think it was Amnesty International came up with the statistics of about 60%
Wow.
of women and girls down to the age of 11 are being assaulted on the way. I think I had a statistic too of some Doctors Without Borders was treating women for cases of sexual violence in the Darien Gap, and they were treating cases down to ages as young as 11, and in 1 year, in 2023, they treated 397 cases of sexual assault. Again, on just one part of the trail, one organization, which there are many who are trying to service the migrants along the way. So this brings us back to when you say that it's great for migrants to come into the country. I actually think it is great for migrants to come into the country legally and safely.
Right.
But to just open up the border for folks to come in at the behest of the cartel, and to be mistreated and raped along the way, that's not something that I could ever sign up for.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I do know too, because I've heard multiple stories of people too, even when they're here, then being controlled by the threat of being reported, right? So whether it's somebody that was an employer that brought them, or that they have to do whatever that person tells them because they know that they're here illegally and they will threaten them. I shared a story in another episode that we did, but when I was a really young teacher in my early 20s, I had a student who I knew that the mom was being beaten up by her husband. And I had a conversation with her because I spoke Spanish, and I talked to her about trying to just suggesting that she get help, and she told me she couldn't get help because he was here legally, she was not, and that he told her that if she ever told anybody, that he would get her sent back to Mexico and she would never see her kids again. And so I had one of her kids in my class, and I just remember that stuck out to me. I mean, it just really struck me at the time, and I thought, that is one person. I wonder how many more of them are there that if they're being brought across, and especially women, right, when they have kids, if they're being told you have to do X, Y, or Z, or I can treat you any way I want to because your kids were born here, right? If they had those children were born once they were here, or one parent is an American citizen and one is not, then they really have talk about a power dynamic. The left likes to talk about that power dynamic, which is not, it's a real thing, but it's just a crazy, like, how many women are there out there who are living that way, afraid to even, they just have no power at all,
right,
to defend themselves or to defend their kids.
Right.
Yeah.
If you think about the cost to come here, to come here from Mexico, let's say on average is about $4,000. It goes up from there. The further afield that you're coming from, could be $15,000 to come from South America, could be $50,000 to come across the ocean. But somebody paid a price for you to get into the country illegally. And if you didn't have the money yourself, which you probably didn't, if you're a migrant who's coming from one of these really poor countries, somebody in the United States sponsored you to come across. And if that's a loving family member, good on you. You're going to have a safe place to live. And if it is a bad actor, then you may be in this situation where you are in effect held hostage if you feel like you can't report to anybody what's going on in your life, or else face the risk of deportation. That's been that is a reality that a lot of folks who are in the country illegally do feel like they are not able to go on to law enforcement. And I think it's a fallacy because there's even some protections within law enforcement when somebody who's been is a migrant who's been a victim of a serious crime, like a rape or a domestic violence offense that's where they've actually been assaulted, that they can actually get on a fast track to getting some privileges to stay in the United States if they go and report. But
they don't know, if they don't know that.
Most people don't know that. And the same is true of the children who come here as unaccompanied minors. Also, somebody had to pay that child's fee to come into the United States. If it's their loving aunt who lives in Nevada. Wonderful. When they get across the border, they're going to pull that phone number on the piece of paper that's in their shoe and give it to the Border Patrol agent, and he'll call the aunt and connect them with that sponsor. But if it's some random gentleman who found them on social media and recruited them to come into the United States, then they're potentially going to find themselves in a pretty horrifying, potentially trafficking situation, or just enslaved to somebody who's a bad actor. And in fact, I saw some news recently that Homeland Security Investigations is trying to go around and do a welfare check on all the kids who've been placed with sponsors to see if they're still in a safe environment, because sometimes it gets rushed. And they end up with somebody who was claimed to be a family member, but wasn't.
Right.
And this article said that in the most horrifying of examples, they show up and there's a teenage girl who's pregnant with the child of the male who has paid her way to come to the United States.
Yeah.
It's pretty important that we know who it is that's paying this fee.
Right. Yeah. And I think those are, some of those things where it's like you think, you're told that the compassion is all on one side, but it's when you start looking at a lot of the realities of what's happening, it's not it's not uncompassionate, or it's not a lack of compassion that wants to stop the cartels, right? Take away that power that they have and try to deal with some of the things that are happening, because it's really not. It's placing people in a position of no power and potentially, a form of slavery, whether it's in a labor sense or whether it's in a sexual trafficking kind of thing, or even, like I was saying, in that domestic violence situation, right? If you're placing people where they're coming in and then they feel like they have no power, you're saying that they, with the laws, but I mean, how many of our people who are born here who don't know what laws say, right? So if you're coming from another country, how are you supposed to know? You just take what you're told, right? Right. Mm-hmm. Whether that's about what's going to happen when you get here, or whether that's about, you can't report things because, so there's a power dynamic.
Right? Yeah, 100%. Knowledge is power.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we had a question too about Attorney General.
Yes, because you ran for Attorney General in 2022.
I did.
Can you tell us what the Attorney General does at the state level?
The Attorney General is an important position in the state. It's the top law enforcement officer in the state, and also a lot of the statewide litigation happens at the Attorney General level. So, I did run in 2022, and the person who got that job is maybe not doing as good of a job in that role as what.
I'm not a fan. I've mentioned it more than once on the show.
Same.
If anyone's listened, I have brought her up a number of times. So, yeah.
You have a bone to pick.
The on the prosecution side, because I was a prosecutor before, I feel very strongly that you have to maintain the integrity in the justice system, and a lot of that comes down to having prosecutors who are going to do the right thing.
Right.
Yes.
And that means not prosecuting people who are innocent, which is in my career was never a problem, because I always worked for folks who were strived for justice more than anything else. And if I ever went to them and said, I got a problem here, I never had an innocence problem, just so you know. I never had a situation where I was like, oh, this person didn't actually do the thing and they've been in jail this whole time, right? But I have had cases where I thought, you know what, the evidence is not quite as good as when I started, and it's not right to pursue a case if you don't think that you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt at trial.
Right.
So I always held myself to a higher standard even than, maybe what would be ethically required. And that's what I taught the folks that I trained as well. That's not necessarily the same standard that's being held to in the office currently. Yeah. And so it is critical. I mean, it's you think of Lady Justice, right? She has a sword and she can wield it. And that means that she really can do harm to people through the criminal justice system if she's not also thinking about the balancing of evidence and being blind to bias.
Yeah.
So that's a key part of that office. And then the other part is the litigation side, and where we find a lot of impact from the state AG is whether they're going to pick particular battles with the federal administration. And in some ways, and I guess the state as well, but it seems like that's where a lot of the
Cases lie.
Yeah, the cases lie. So, you have to think about what are the legal principles that are important to you, and what are the guiding principles that are important to you.
Right.
And do you want your attorney general to be fighting against the things that you value or fighting for the things that you value?
Right.
And it can really have a significant impact on what goes on in the state.
Yeah, and I know we've talked here about, there are state laws that are passed specifically related to abortion, and then they get a lawsuit from Planned Parenthood or from somebody, and if the attorney general is like, nope, I'm not going to defend that law, or with girls' sports, we had it with the Title IX things, and they're just like, nope, we're going to not defend state law. Or on the other side too, I've seen, and I talked about it in one episode, but specifically it was in New Mexico, where it was like the fetal trafficking. And so you had this whole ring of things going on where it was like the University of New Mexico was sending things to the Southwest Women's Options abortion clinic. And they were doing all this, they're sending them abortionists that they're training, and they're getting fetal parts back, and they're doing this like trafficking thing with fetal organs. And it was reported to Congress at the U.S. level about what was going on. And so Congress, because would be the way that you would do it, sent it back to the state attorney general, who looked at it and went, oh, nothing's happening here. There's nothing to even look at. But he was somebody who had been funded and had gotten campaign contributions from these abortion entities, right? So it's like that you have the ability, and I think this is why a lot of, especially in the pro-abortion arena, they've really tried to stack attorney generals across the states in these topics where they have, because they really can do a lot of damage, both with not investigating things that are clearly going on, whether that's election fraud or whether it's things related to the border or things related to abortion or whatever, that they just don't want to even look under the rug, right? And they're like, oh, there's nothing to see here, so I'm not going to prosecute. Or they won't defend state laws, or they'll fight with the federal government over things that are happening that, shouldn't be fought about.
Right.
That it's not what the state is best for the state, right? The state interest. So it really is a big deal who is the attorney general, and I guarantee you it's a position that most people don't pay any attention to at all.
I think that we have been become more aware in recent years about folks trying to put their own puppets into like the district attorney positions and the county attorney positions, right? We've seen that across the country in some important big cities around the country, right?
Yes.
I think that folks are just now starting to wake up to the fact that the exact same actors are trying to put their own puppet in the AG's office. And that if you don't think that that's happening, I'm here to tell you it's happening. That there are folks who have a particular agenda, a progressive agenda, that want to have someone in these roles that they can push to forward their agenda at all costs. And I actually am somebody who doesn't think that role, you should ever be forwarding a particular agenda. It is the role of the Attorney General to defend state laws as long as they are constitutional.
Whether you agree with them or not. Right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Because it's the legislature's job to make a law.
Yes.
Not the Attorney General. The Attorney General is supposed to be defending what the legislature does, again, unless the Attorney General looks at the law and says, this is unconstitutional, it's just not defensible. Great, that's the right decision. And it would be the right decision if it was a conservative law that I agreed with, but I knew it was unconstitutional. I actually would hope to, if I were Attorney General, would get involved in that conversation on the front end with the legislature, because I've found that the folks over there are actually pretty reasonable when you have a conversation with them about, hey, here's a flaw.
Change this wording, remove this, add this. Yeah.
And I actually think that our legislature's done a very good job of trying to pass laws that
We've gotten better over the years because there were a lot of lawsuits, I agree with you. I think that was not always the case.
Yeah.
And here lately it has been the case where they've been trying to look and avoid some of those legal pitfalls.
Right.
Where they would write things
So I would
wrong.
agree with you. I think they are reasonable. Yeah.
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 And then, on the other side, if the legislature passed a law that I didn't agree with, perhaps it didn't meet my moral beliefs, but it was lawful and constitutional, the Attorney General's job is to defend that law, because that's what the legislature decided to do. So then you get new legislators if you don't like the law that they passed, or you pass a proposition in Arizona if you don't like the law that was passed. Those are the two bodies that are supposed to be making the laws, not the Attorney General.
Right.
So it is not
the
okay.
courts,
It's not okay for the Attorney General to abdicate the duty just because she doesn't like what the legislature is doing.
Well, we're seeing that right now with Isaacson versus Arizona, where they're trying to get rid of a bunch of laws that are on the books protecting women related to abortion. And she's just like, nope, I'm not going to defend them. I don't want them there, so I'm not going to defend them. Not looking at whether they're constitutional or they were legally enacted, right? So not defending those. So it is a big deal. So we want you to pay attention to this next year. So 2026, Arizona will be electing an attorney general, a governor, attorney general, secretary of state. So that is a job that you have not paid any attention to at all. Really and truly, please start looking at who is running and do your own vetting and figure out, is this person going to represent Arizona well and fight for those things that they should be fighting for and not play politics with that role. Yeah.
100%. Because I was like, how long can the cases stay pending for? If they were like, I'm not going to uphold it, they could just sit around forever? Is that...
well, no, I think wouldn't they just rule summarily, like with it, if there's nobody to defend, like if there's a lawsuit brought against.
But nobody to defend it.
There's usually somebody who's a named party that has their own counsel. That will is still, so it'll still keep going.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The lawsuit will still happen, but it's just the Attorney General's office doesn't defend
Right.
it. Yeah.
Doesn't do their job.
Right.
Yeah. I was just wondering.
Yeah. Yeah. So is that it?
Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to add to any of that stuff? Anything you didn't get to talk about?
I don't think so.
I think we talked about a lot. We
did.
A lot. Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I've wanted to have a conversation about this, but in a way that's not. You can't, because people get so emotionally charged on every side of this issue, and to just be able to talk about all the things that are happening reasonably. I've been wanting to do that for a while, and it's been tough to find somebody that I felt like would do it justice. And so I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about this topic and just hearing and your level of expertise that you've had, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a good conversation. So thank you for joining us on Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media to find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.